Welcome everyone to the bar. Please take a seat. Staff will be with you shortly to take your orders and enjoy your evening's entertainment. Today we are continuing Literature Night, continuing with the third part of Star Wars Darth Bane, Path of Destruction, written by Drew Karpyshyn. Do note that I have just installed Stream Elements, so there might be a... that. There might be some... If anyone's going to be typing anything, just do take note because I haven't fully configured it yet. I am not sure the parameters of the parameters. So, do bear with me, I'm still learning how to use it. Alright, let's continue with part 2. Chapter 9. Peace is a lie. There is only passion. Through passion, I gain strength. Through strength, I gain power. Through power, I gain victory. Through victory, the chains are broken. Copex was gone, rejoining Khan's army and the war being waged against the Jedi and the Republic. Bane had remained behind at the Sith Academy on Korriban to learn the ways of the Sith. His first lesson began the next morning at the feet of Lord Cordus himself. The tenets of the Sith are more than just words to be memorized, the master of the academy explained to his newest apprentice. Learn them, understand them. They will lead you to the true power of the Force, the power of the dark side. Cordus was taller than Copex, taller even than Bane. He was very thin, and clad in a black, loose-fitting robe, with the hood drawn back to fall across his shoulders. He might have been human, but something about his appearance seemed off. His skin was an unnatural, chalky hue, made even more obvious by the glittering gems encrusting the many rings on his long fingers. His eyes were dark and sunken, his teeth were sharp and pointed, and his fingernails were curved and wicked talons. Bane knelt before him, similarly clad in a dark robe with the hood drawn back. Earlier this morning, he had heard the code of the Sith for the first time, and the words were still fresh and mysterious. They swirled through the undercurrents of his mind, occasionally bubbling up into his conscious thoughts as he tried to absorb the deeper meaning behind them. Peace is a lie. There is only passion. Bane knew the first tenet to be true, at least. His entire life was proof of it. Copex tells me you come to us as a raw apprentice, Cordus noted. He says you have never been trained in the ways of the Force. Is that correct? That is correct. I am a quick learner, Bane assured him. Yes, and strong in the power of the dark side, but the same can be said of all who come here. Not sure how to respond, Bane decided that the wisest course of action was to remain silent. What do you know of this academy? Cordus finally asked. The students here are taught to use the Force. They are taught the secrets of the dark side by you and the other Sith Lords. After a brief hesitation, he added, and I know there are many other academies like this one. No, Cordus corrected. Not like this one, Bane. It is true we have other training facilities spread across our ever-growing empire. Places where individuals with promise are taught to control and use their power. But each facility is unique, and where individual students are sent depends on how much potential we see in them. Those with a noticeable but limited ability are sent to Honogar, Gentis, or Gamor to become Sith warriors or marauders. There, they are taught to channel their emotions into mindless rage and battle fury. The power of the dark side transforms them into ravaging beasts of death and destruction to be unleashed against our enemies. Through passion, I gain strength, Bane thought. But when he spoke, he said, brute strength alone is not enough to bring down the Republic. True, Cordes agreed. From the tone of his voice, Bane knew he had said what his master wanted to hear. Those with greater ability are sent to worlds that have allied with our cause to destroy the Republic. Ryloth, Umbara, Nar Shaddaa. These students become creatures of shadow, learning to use the dark side for secrecy, deception, and manipulation. Those who survive the training become unstoppable assassins, capable of drawing on the dark side to kill their targets without ever moving a muscle. Yet even they are no match for the Jedi, Bane added, thinking he now understood the direction the lesson was taking. Precisely, his master agreed. The academies on Dathomir and Iridonia are most similar to the one here. There, apprentices study under Sith masters. Those who succeed in their training become the adepts and acolytes who swell the ranks of our armies. They are the counterparts to the Jedi Knights who stand in the way of our ultimate conquest. But even as the Jedi Knights must answer to the Jedi Masters, so must the adepts and acolytes answer to the Sith Lords. And those with the potential to become Sith Lords, and only those with such potential, are trained here, Bane, on Korriban. Bane felt a shiver of excitement. Through strength, I gain power. He repeated that in his head. Korriban was the ancestral home of the Sith, Cordes explained. This planet is a place of great power. The dark side lives and breathes in the very core of this world. He paused and slowly extended his skeletal hand palm upwards. It almost seemed as if he was cradling something unseen, something precious and invaluable in his claw-like fingers. This temple we stand in was built by many, many people thousands of years ago to collect and focus that power. Here you can feel the dark side at its strongest. He closed his fist so tightly that his long fingernails cut into his palm, drawing blood. You have been chosen, Bane. You have been chosen because you have great potential, he whispered. Great things are expected of the apprentices here on Korriban. The training is difficult. Rewards are great for those who succeed. Through power, I gain victory. Bane finally understood. Cordes reached out and placed his wounded palm on the crown of Bane's bare skull, anointing him with the blood of a Sith Lord. Bane had seen plenty of blood as a soldier, yet for some reason, this ceremonial act of self-mutilation revolted him more than any battlefield gore. It was all he could do, not to pull away. You, Bane, have the potential to become one of us, not like those Sith warriors or marauders, not like the Sith shadows and assassins, not even like the adepts and acolytes trained on Iridonia. You have the potential to become one of us, one of the Brotherhood of Darkness. Together, we can cast off the shackles of the Republic and rule this galaxy. And the final line of the Sith Code is made clear to Bane. Through victory, my chains are broken. But even those with potential can fail, Cordis finished. I trust you will not disappoint us, Bane. Bane had no intention of doing that. The next few weeks passed quickly as Bane threw himself into his studies. To his surprise, he discovered that his inexperience with the Force was the exception rather than the rule. Many of the students had trained for months or even years before they were even accepted at the academy on Korriban. At first, Bane found this troubling. He had just started his training and he was already behind. In such a competitive, ruthless environment, he would be an easy target for every other student. But as he mulled it over, he began to realize he might not be as vulnerable as he thought. He alone, of all the apprentices at the academy, had been able to manifest the power of the dark side. Without any training at all. He'd used it so often, he'd come to take it for granted. It had given him advantages over his opponents in cards and brawling. In war, it had warned him of danger and brought him victory in otherwise impossible circumstances. And all of that he'd done on pure instinct, with no training, without even any conscious idea of what he was doing. Now, for the first time, he was being taught to truly use his abilities. He didn't have to worry about any of the other students. If anything, they should be worrying about him. When? No. Once he completes his training, none of the other students or acolytes, or even the Sith Masters themselves, would be his equal. Most of his learning came at the feet of Cordis and the other Masters, Kasim, Orlitha, Shinayag, Hezaran, and Borthas. There were group training sessions at the academy, but they were few and far between. The weak and the slow could not be allowed to hold back the strong and ambitious. Students learned at their own pace, driven by their desire and hunger for power. There were, however, nearly 6 students for every master, and the apprentices had to prove their worth before one of the instructors would spend even a single ounce of their valuable time teaching them the secrets of the Sith. Though he was only but a neophyte, Bane found it easy to garner the attention of the Sith Lords, particularly Cordis himself. He knew the extra attention would inevitably breed animosity in the other students, but he forced himself not to think about it. In time, the additional instructions he got from the Masters would allow him to catch up to and pass the other apprentices, and once he did, he would no longer need to worry about their petty jealousies. Until then, he was to be careful to stay out of the way and to not draw attention to himself. When he wasn't learning at the feet of the Masters, he was in the library, studying the ancient records. As the Jedi kept their archives at their temple on Coruscant, so too the Sith had begun to collect and store information in the archives of Korriban's temple. However, unlike the Jedi library, where most of the data was stored in electronic, holographic, and holocron formats, the Sith collection was limited to scrolls, tomes, and manuals. In the 3,000 standard years since Darth Revan had nearly destroyed the Republic, the Jedi had waged a tireless war to eradicate the teaching tools of the dark side. All known Sith holocrons had been either destroyed or spirited away to the Jedi Temple in Coruscant for safekeeping. There were many rumors of undiscovered Sith holocrons that had either been, well, hidden away on remote worlds, or covetously hoarded by one of the Dark Masters themselves, eager to keep its secret knowledge to themselves. But all efforts by the Brotherhood to find these lost treasures had proven futile, forcing them to rely on the primitive technologies of parchment and flimsiplast. And because the collection was constantly being added to, the indexes and references were hopelessly out of date. Searching the archives was as often an exercise in futility or frustration, and most of the other students felt that time was better spent trying to learn from or impress their Sith masters. Perhaps it was because he was older than most of the others, or maybe because his years of mining taught him patience. Whatever the explanation, Bane found and spent several hours each day studying the ancient records. He found them fascinating. Many of the scrolls were historical records recounting ancient battles or glorifying the deeds of ancient Sith lords. By itself, the information had little practical use, but he could see each individual work for what it actually represented. A tiny piece of a much larger puzzle, a clue to a much greater understanding. The archives supplemented what he learned from the masters. It gave context to abstract lessons. Bane felt that, in time, the ancient knowledge would be the key to unlocking his full potential. And so his understanding of the Force slowly took shape. Mystical and unexplainable, the Force was also natural and essential. A fundamental energy binding the universe and connecting all living things within it. This energy, this power, could be harnessed. It could be manipulated and controlled. And through the teachings of the dark side, Bane was learning to seize hold of it. He practiced his meditations and exercises daily, often under the watchful eye of Cordis himself. After only a few weeks, he learned to move small objects simply by thinking about it, something he would have thought completely impossible only a short time before. Yet now he has understood that this was only just the beginning. He was starting to grasp a great truth on a deep, fundamental level. That the strength to survive must come from within. Others will always fail you. Friends, family, fellow soldiers. In the end, each person stands alone. When in need, look only to yourself. The dark side nurtured the power of the individual. The teachings of the Sith masters would make him strong. In pleasing them, he would unlock his full potential, and one day sit amongst them as equals. Elsewhere, on above the planet of Rusan, when the first wave of the attack came, the Republic fleet orbiting the skies of Rusan was caught completely unprepared. A small and politically insignificant planet. The heavily forested world had been used as a base to stage devastating hit-and-run attacks against the Sith forces stationed in the nearby Kashyyyk system. Now the enemy had turned the same strategy against them. The Sith struck without warning, materializing en masse from hyperspace, an almost suicidal maneuver for such a massive fleet. However, before an alarm could even be sounded, the Republic ships found themselves being bombarded by 3 dreadnought cruisers, 2 Corsair battleships, dozens of interceptors, and a score of buzzard fighters. And at the head of the attack was the flagship of the Brotherhood of Darkness itself, the Sith destroyer Nightfall. In his meditation sphere aboard Nightfall, Lord Khan was directing the assault. From inside the chamber, he could communicate with any of the other ships, issuing his orders with the knowledge that they would be instantly and completely obeyed. The chamber was alive with light and sound. Glowing monitors and flashing screens beeped incessantly to alert him to the constantly changing updates on the status of the battle. The Dark Lord, however, never even glanced at the screens. His perception extended far beyond the meditation sphere, far beyond the data spit out by the electronic readouts. He knew the location of each vessel engaged in the conflict, those of his own and those of the enemy. He could sense every volley being fired, every evasive turn and roll, every move and counter-move made by every ship. Often he could sense them even before they happened. His brow was knotted in intense concentration. His breath came in long, ragged gasps. Beads of perspiration rolled down his trembling body. The strain was enormous, yet with the aid of the meditation sphere, he maintained his mental focus, drawing on the dark side of the Force to influence the outcome of the conflict despite his physical exhaustion. The art of battle meditation, a weapon passed down from the ancient Sith sorcerers through the enemy ranks into chaos, feeding their fear and hopelessness, crushing their hearts and spirits with bleak despair. Every false move by the opponent was magnified. Every hesitation was transformed into a cascade of errors and mistakes that overwhelmed even the most disciplined troops. The battle had only just begun, and it was already all but over. The Republic fleet was in complete disarray. 2 of its 4 Hammerhead-class capital ships had lost primary shields in the first strafing run of the Buzzards. Now the Sith dreadnoughts were moving in, targeting the suddenly vulnerable Hammerheads with their devastating forward-mounted laser cannons. On the verge of being crippled and left utterly helpless, they were just now managing to scramble their own fighters to ward off the rapidly closing enemy cruisers. The other 2 capital ships were being ravaged by rage and fury. The Sith battleships. The ponderous Republic hammerheads relied on support ships to establish a defensive line to hold off enemy attackers. While they positioned themselves to bring their heavy guns to bear. Without these defensive lines, they were all but helpless against the much quicker and more nimble Corsairs. Rage and fury cut in along a vector that minimized the number of cannons the hammerheads could target them with, then swept across their bows, firing all guns. When their hammerheads tried to change direction to bring more guns to bear, the Corsairs would pivot and double back for another pass along a different vector, inflicting even more damage. The savage maneuver was known as slashing the deck, and without the support of fighters or battleships of their own, the capital ships couldn't withstand it for long. Aid from the Republic battleships, however, was not likely to come at all. The one on point patrol was already a charred and lifeless hull, obliterated in the first seconds of the attack by a direct hit from Nightfall's guns before it could even raise its shields. The other 2 were being swarmed by interceptors and pounded by Nightfall's broadside laser artillery, and didn't figure to last much longer than the first. Khan could feel it. Panic had set in amongst the Republic troops and commanders. His attack was pure offense, yes. His strategy maximized damage, but left his own ships exposed and vulnerable to a well-organized counterattack. But no such response was forthcoming. The Republic captains were unable to coordinate their efforts, unable to establish their line of defense. They couldn't even organize a proper retreat. Escape was completely impossible. Han knew victory was his. And then suddenly, Fury was gone, snuffed out by an explosion that ripped the Corsair apart. It had happened so quickly that Khan, even with the precognitive awareness of his battle meditation, hadn't sensed it coming. The two hammerheads had turned at tangential angles, both somehow locking in Fury's path simultaneously. One had opened up with his forward cannons to take down Fury's shields, while the other had unleashed a barrage of laser fire at the exact same spot, causing a massive detonation that destroyed the battleship in the blink of an eye. It was a brilliant maneuver. Two different ships perfectly coordinating their efforts while under relentless assault to wipe out a common foe. It was also impossible. Han ordered Rage into evasive actions. The Corsair peeled off its attack run just as the hammerheads opened fire, narrowly avoiding the fate of his sister ship. The dreadnoughts closing in on the crippled hammerheads were also forced to break off their attack run as 4 full squads of Republic fighters burst forth from the cargo bays of their supposedly defenseless prey. Even under ideal conditions, it would have been hard to scramble the fighters so quickly. In this situation, it was unthinkable. Yet Khan could feel them. Nearly 50 Auric fighters flying in tight formation, pressing the attack on the dreadnoughts, while all 4 hammerheads pulled back. They were establishing a defensive line. Drawing on the power of the dark side, Lord Khan pushed out with his will to touch the minds of the enemy. They were grim, but not desperate. Some were afraid, but none panicked. All he felt from them was discipline, purpose, and resolve. And then he felt something else. Another presence in the battlefield. It was subtle, but he was certain it hadn't been there at all in the first few minutes of the attack. Someone was using the Force to bolster the morale of the Republic troops. Someone was using the light side to counter the effects of Khan's battle meditation and turn the tides of the battle. Only a Jedi Master would have the strength to oppose the will of a Sith Lord. Kopecz felt it too. Strapped into the seat of his interceptor, he was spinning and swerving through the hammerhead's barrage of anti-fighter turret blasts. The presence of the Jedi Master crashed over him like a wave. It caught him off guard, causing him to lose his focus for a split second. For any other pilot, that would have been enough to end his life. But Kopecz was no ordinary pilot. Reacting with a quickness born of instinct, honed by training and bolstered by the power of the dark side, he slammed the throttle back and pushed hard on the stick. The interceptor lurched down and forward into a sharp dive, narrowly ducking beneath 3 successive blasts of the hammerhead's ion cannons. Pulling out of the dive, he banked into a wide roll and circled back towards the largest of the 4 Republic cruisers. The Jedi was there. He could sense them. The Force was emanating from the ship like a beacon. Now Kopecz was going to kill them. Back on Nightfall, Khan was also locked in mortal combat with the Jedi Master, though theirs was a battle waged through their ships and pilots of their respective fleets. The Republic had more ships with greater firepower. Khan had been relying on the element of surprise, and his battle meditation gave the Sith an advantage. Now, however, both of those advantages had been nullified. Despite this strength, the Dark Lord was no expert in the rare art of battle meditation. It was one of many talents, and he had worked to develop them all equally. The opposing Jedi, however, had likely been trained from birth for just such a confrontation. The tide of the battle was slowly turning, and the Dark Lord was becoming desperate. He gathered his will and lashed out with a sudden surge of power from the dark side, a desperate gambit to swing the engagement back under his control. Spurred on by adrenaline, bloodlust, and the irresistible compulsion of their leader, a pair of buzzard pilots tried to ram their ships into the nearest Oryx squadron, determined to break their formation with a suicide attack. But the Republic pilots didn't panic, nor break ranks trying to avoid their relentless and reckless charge. Instead, they met the assault head-on, firing their weapons and vaporizing the enemy before any harm could be done. On the other side of the battle, Kopek's interceptor knifed through the defensive perimeter established around the capital ship and its precious Jedi cargo. Too quick and nimble for either the Oryx fighters or the turrets to get a lock. Penetrating the Republic lines, Kopek flew his ship into the heart of the main hangar. The blast doors closed a fraction of a second too late. He opened fire as his ship spun and skidded across the docking bay's floor, wiping out most of the soldiers unfortunate enough to be caught inside. As the ship slowed to a halt, he popped open the hatch and flipped out of his seat. Nimbly landing on his feet, he drew and ignited his lightsaber in one smooth motion. The first sweeping arc of the Crimson Blade caught the blaster fire of the two troops who had survived the initial assault, deflecting it harmlessly away. Another flip closed the 6-meter distance between the Twi'lek and his attackers. Another arc of the blade ended their lives. Kopek paused to assess the situation. Mangled bodies and shattered machinery were all that remained of the crew and equipment that maintained the Republic fighters. Smiling, he crossed over to the hatch leading into the interior of the capital ship. He strode quickly and confident through the halls, guided by the power emanating from the Jedi Master like a toccata drawn by the scent of a squelabug. A security team intercepted him in one of the hallways. The red badges on their sleeves marked them as an elite squad of specially trained soldiers, the best bodyguards the Republic military had to offer. Kopek knew they must have been good. One actually managed to fire her weapon twice before the entire unit fell to his lightsaber after all. He entered a large chamber with a single door at the back. His prey was beyond that door. But in the center of the room, a pair of Selkath, amphibious beings from the world of Manan, barred his way with lightsabers drawn. These were mere Padawans, however, servants of their Jedi Master. Kopek didn't even bother engaging them in lightsaber combat. Why would he? It was beneath him. Instead, he thrust a meaty fist forward and used the force to hurl them across the room. The first Padawan was stunned by the impact. By the time he struggled uncertainly to his feet, his companion was already dead, the life choked out of her by the power of the dark side. The surviving Padawan retreated as Kopek slowly advanced. The Sith Lord crossed the room with measured strides as he gathered his power. He unleashed it in a storm of electricity. Bolts of blue-violet lightning ripped through the flesh of his unfortunate victim. The Selkath's body danced in a convulsion of agony until his smoking corpse finally collapsed to the floor. Reaching the door at the rear of the room, Kopek opened it and stepped into the small meditation chamber beyond. An elderly Syrian female, clad in the simple brown robes of a Jedi Master, was seated cross-legged on the floor. Her creased and wrinkled face was bathed in sweat from the strain of using her battle meditation against Khan and the Sith. Exhausted, drained, she was no match for the Sith Lord who now loomed over her. Yet she made no attempts or move to flee, or even defend herself. With certain death only seconds away, she kept her mind and power focused entirely on the fleet battle. Kopek couldn't help but admire her courage, even as he methodically cut her down. Her calm acceptance robbed his victory of any joy. "Peace is a lie," he muttered to himself, as he stalked back through the halls towards the docking bay and his waiting ship. Anxious to leave before Nightfall or one of the other ships blew this hammer hit to bits. The death of the Jedi Master turned the tide once more in the Sith's favor. The resistance crumbled, the battle became a Sith rout, and then a slaughter. No longer protected by the power of the light side of the Force, the Republic soldiers were completely demoralized when the terror and despair Khan spawned in their minds. Those who were strong-willed gave up all hope save that of escaping the battle alive. The weak ones were left so despondent they could only hope for a quick and merciful death. The former wouldn't get what they wanted, but the latter did. Strapped into the hatch of his interceptor, Lord Kopex launched his craft from the hangar mere seconds before the capital ship was destroyed in a glorious and cataclysmic explosion. The Sith losses that day were heavier than expected, but their victory was absolute. Not a single Republic ship, pilot, or soldier escaped the first battle of Ruusan alive. Hello everyone, I'll be taking a short water break before I continue to chapter 10, so give me a small moment. And with that, I'm back. Let's continue to chapter 10. Bane's power was growing. In only a few months of training, he had learned much about the Force and the power of the dark side. Physically, he felt stronger than ever before. In morning training runs, he could sprint at nearly full speed for 5 kilometers before he even began breathing heavily. His reflexes were quicker. His mind and senses were sharper than he possibly could have ever imagined. When necessary, he could channel the Force through his body, giving him bursts of energy that allowed him to do seemingly impossible feats, performing full flips from a standing position, survive falls from incredible heights uninjured, leap vertically 10 meters or more. He was completely aware of his surroundings at all times, sensing the presence of others. Sometimes, he could even get a feel of their intentions, vague impressions of their very thoughts. He was able to levitate larger objects now, and for longer periods, with each lesson his power grew. It became easier and easier to command the Force and bend it to his will. And with each week passing, Bane realized he had surpassed another batch of apprentices who had once been ahead of him. Less and less of his time was spent in the archives studying the ancient scrolls. His initial fascination with them had faded, swept away by the intensity of academy life. Absorbing the knowledge of masters long dead was a cold and sterile pleasure. Historical records were no competition for the feeling of exhilaration and power he felt when actually using the Force. Bane was part of the Academy and the Brotherhood of Darkness. He was part of the now, not the ancient past. He began to spend more time mingling with the other students. Already he could sense that some of them were jealous, though none dared to act against him directly. Competition amongst the students was encouraged, and the masters allowed the rivalry to drift into animosity and hatred that fueled the dark side. But there were harsh penalties for any apprentices caught interfering with or disrupting the training of another student. Of course, all the apprentices understood that the punishment was not actually for interrupting or disrupting the training of another student. It was actually for the crime of being careless enough to get caught. Treachery was tactically accepted, as long as it was done with enough cunning to avoid the notice of the instructors. Bane's phenomenal progress protected him from the machinations of his fellow students. No one could move against him without drawing the attention of Cordis the other Sith Lords. Unfortunately, the extra attention made it difficult for Bane himself to use treachery, manipulation, or similar techniques to attain greater status within the Academy. There was, however, one sanctioned way students could bring a rival down: Lightsaber Combat, the chosen weapon of both the Jedi and the Sith. The lightsaber was more than just a blade of energy capable of cutting through almost every material in the known galaxy. The lightsaber was an extension of the user and his or her command of the Force. Only those with strict mental discipline and total physical mastery could use the weapon effectively. Or so Bane and the others had been taught. Few of the other students actually possessed lightsabers yet. They still had to prove themselves worthy in the eyes of Cordis and the others. Yet that didn't keep Lord Kasim, the Twi'lek Blade Master, from instructing them in the styles and techniques they would use once they had finally earned their weapons. Each morning, the apprentices would gather on the wide, open roof of the temple to practice their drills and routines under his watchful eye, struggling to learn the exotic maneuvers that would bring them victory on the battlefield. Perspiration was already running down the crown of Bane's head and into his eyes as he put his body through its paces. He blinked away the stinging sweat and redoubled his exertion, carving the air before him again and again and again with his training saber. All around him, other apprentices were doing the same. Each was struggling to conquer his or her own physical limitations and becoming more than just a warrior with a weapon. The goal was to become an extension of the dark side itself. Bane had begun by learning the basic techniques common to all 7 traditional lightsaber forms. His first weeks had been spent in endless repetition of defensive postures, overhand strikes, parries, and counter-strikes. By observing the natural tendencies of his students as they learned the basics, Lord Kasim determined which form would best match their style. For Bane, he chose Gemso, Form V, or Form 5. The 5th form emphasized strength and power, allowing Bane to use his size and muscle to his best advantage. Only after he was able to perform each of the moves of Gemso to the satisfaction of Kasim was he allowed to begin the real training. Now, along with the other students at the academy, he spent the better part of an hour each morning practicing his techniques with his training saber under the Blade Master's watchful eye. Made of durasteel with blunted edges, the training sabers were crafted specifically so that their balance and heft mimicked the energy beams projected by real lightsabers. A solid blow could inflict serious damage, but since a lightsaber did not work that way, each training blade was also covered with millions of toxin-filled barbs too small to see, fashioned from the microscopic ridge spines of the deadly pelko bug, a rare insect found only deep beneath the desert sands of the Valley of the Dark Lords on Korriban itself. With a direct hit, the minuscule barbs could pierce the weave of any fabric. the pelco venom would cause the flesh to immediately burn and blister. Temporary paralysis set in instantly at the point of infection, leaving any limbs stuck or struck all but useless. This provided an excellent way to mimic the effects of losing a hand, arm, or leg to a lightsaber blade. The morning was filled with the grunts of the apprentices and the swish, swish, swish of their blades slicing the air. In some ways, it reminded Bane of his military training, a group of soldiers united in the repetition of drills until the moves became instinctive. But there was no sense of camaraderie at the academy. The apprentices were rivals, plain and simple. In many ways, it wasn't that different from his days on Apatros. Now, however, the isolation was worth it. Here they were teaching him the secrets of the dark side. Wrong! Kasim suddenly barked. He had been walking up and down the ranks of apprentices as they trained, but had now stopped right beside Bane. Strike with malice and precision! He reached out and seized Bane's wrist, turning it roughly and changing the angle of the training blade. You're coming in too high, he snapped. There is no room for error, Bane. He stayed at Bane's side for several seconds, watching to ensure the lesson had been properly learned. After several hard thrusts by Bane with the altered grip, the Blade Master nodded in approval and continued his rounds. Bane repeated the single move over and over, careful to maintain the height and angle of the blade exactly as Blade Master Kasim had shown him, teaching his muscles through countless repetitions until they could replicate it flawlessly each and every time. Only then would he move on to incorporating it into more complicated maneuvers. Soon, he was breathing heavily from his exertions. Physically, Kasim's training sessions couldn't measure up to hammering a cortosis vein with a hydraulic jack for hours at a time. But they were far more exhausting in other ways. They demanded intense mental focus, and attention to detail that went far beyond what was visible to the naked eye. True mastery of the blade required a combination of both the body and mind. When two masters engaged in lightsaber combat, the action happened too quickly for the eye to see or the mind to react. Everything had to be done on instinct. The body had to be trained to move and respond without conscious thought. To accomplish this, Kasim made his students practice sequences, carefully choreographed series of multiple strikes and parries drawn from their chosen style. The sequences were designed by the Blade Master himself so that each maneuver flowed smoothly into the next, maximizing attack efficiency while minimizing defensive exposure. Using a sequence in combat allowed the students to free their minds from thoughts as their bodies automatically continued through the moves. Using sequences was more efficient and more quicker than considering and initiating each strike or block on its own, providing an enormous advantage over an opponent unfamiliar with the technique. However, ingraining a new sequence so it could be properly executed was a long and laborious process. For many, it would take 2 to 3 weeks of training and drills, longer if the sequence was derived from a style the student was still struggling to master. And even the tiniest mistake in the smallest of moves could render the entire sequence worthless. Kasim had spotted a potentially fatal flaw in Bane's technique. Now Bane was determined to fix it, even if it meant hours of practice on his own time. Bane was relentless in his pursuit of perfection, not just in his combat training, but in all his studies. He was a man on a mission. Enough, Kasim's voice called out. At that single command, all the students stopped what they were doing and turned their attention to the Blade Master. He was standing at the head of the assemblage, facing them. "You may rest for 10 minutes, he told them. "Then, the challenges will begin." Bane, along with most of the others, lowered himself into a meditative position. Legs crossed and folded beneath him, laying his training saber on the ground beside him. He closed his eyes and slipped into a light trance, drawing on the dark side to rejuvenate his aching muscles and refresh his tired mind. He allowed the power to flow through him, let his mind drift. As it often did, it drifted back to the first time he touched the dark side. Not the fumbling brushes he'd had back on Apatros or during his days as a soldier, but a true recognition of the Force. It had been his third day here at the academy. He'd been applying the meditation techniques he'd learned the day before when suddenly he felt it. It was like the bursting of a dam, a raging river flooding through him, sweeping away all his failings, his weakness, his fear, his self-doubt. In that instant, he understood why he was here. At that moment, his transformation from Death to Bane, from mere mortal to one of the Sith, had truly begun. Through power, I gain victory. Through victory, my chains are broken. Bane knew all about chains. Some were obvious: an abusive, uncaring father, grueling shifts in the mines, debts owed to a faceless, ruthless corporation. Others were more subtle. The Republic and its idealistic promises of a better life that never materialized. The Jedi and their vow to rid the galaxy of injustice. Even his friends in the Gloomwalkers had been a kind of chain. He'd cared for them, been responsible for them. Yet in the end, what use had they been when he needed them most? He understood now that personal attachments could only hold him back. Friends were a burden. He had to rely on himself and only himself. He had to develop his own potential, his own power. In the end, that was what it really came down to. Power. And above all else, the dark side promised power. He heard the sounds of movement around him, the soft shuffle of robes as the other apprentices rose from their meditations and made their way towards the challenge ring. He grabbed his training saber with one hand and sprang to his feet to join them. At the end of each session, the class would gather in a wide, irregular circle at the top of the temple. Any student could step into the circle and issue a challenge to another. Seem would observe the duels closely, and once it was over, he would analyze the action for the class. Those who won would be praised for their performance, and their status in the informal hierarchy of the academy would rise. Those who lost, however, would be chastised for their failings, as well as suffering a blow to their prestige. When Bane had first begun his training, many of the students had eagerly called him out. They knew he was a neophyte in the Force, and they were eager to take down the heavily muscled giant in front of their classmates. At first he had declined the challenges. He knew they were the quickest way to gain prestige at the academy, but he wasn't foolish enough to be drawn into a battle he was guaranteed to lose. In the past months, however, he had worked hard to learn his style and refine his technique. He has learned the new sequences quickly, and when Qasim himself had commented on his progress, Bane had felt confident enough to begin accepting the challenges. He wasn't victorious every time, but he was winning far more duels than he was losing, slowly climbing his way to the top of the ladder. Today, Bane felt ready to take another step. The apprentices were standing 3 rows deep, forming a ring of bodies around a clearing in the center, roughly 10 meters in diameter. Kasim stepped into the middle. He didn't speak, but merely tilted his head, a sign that it was time for the challenges to begin. Bane stepped into the center before anyone else could make a move. "I challenge Foharg," he announced in ringing tones. "And I accept," came the reply from somewhere else in the crowd on the opposite side. The apprentices parted to let the one challenge to pass. Kasim gave a slight bow to each combatant and stepped to the clearing's edge to give them room. Foharg was a Markuth. In many ways, he reminded Bane of the Trandoshans he had fought in his days with the Gloomwalkers. Both species were bipedal, saurian lizard-like humanoids covered in leathery green scales, but the Markuths had 4 curved horns growing from the top of their heads. Early in Bane's training, he had fought Foharg, and he had lost badly. The Markuth were nocturnal by nature, like the miners of the night shift on Apatros. However, he had grown accustomed to an unnatural schedule in order to train with the rest of the apprentices at the academy. During their first duel, Bane had underestimated Foharg, expecting him to be sluggish and slow during the daylight hours. He wouldn't make that mistake twice. As Kasim and the apprentices watched in silence, the two combatants circled each other in the ring, training sabers held out before them in standard ready stances. The Markuth's breath came in grunts and growls from his flaring nostrils as he tried to intimidate his human opponent. From time to time, he'd give a short bellow and shake his 4-horned lizard's head while flashing his savage teeth. The last time Bane faced the green-scaled, snorting demon of an apprentice, Bane had been intimidated by Foharg's act. Now he simply ignored the posturing. Bane lunged out with a simple overhand strike, but Foharg responded with a quick parry to deflect the blow to the side. Instead of the crackle and hum of blades of pure energy crossing, there was a loud clang as the weapons clashed. Immediately, the combatants spun away from each other and resumed their ready positions. Excuse me? Alright. Bane rushed forward, his blade ascending diagonally from right to left in a long, swift arc. Foharg managed to redirect the impact of his own weapon, but lost his balance and stumbled back. Bane tried to press his advantage, his training saber arcing up from left to right. His opponent spun out of harm's way, backpedaling quickly to create space. Bane broke off the half-completed sequence and settled back into the ready position. Back on Apatros, his latent abilities in the Force had allowed him to anticipate and react to the moves of his foe. Here, however, every opponent enjoyed the same advantage. As a result, victory required a combination of the Force and physical skill. Bane had worked on acquiring that physical skill over the past months. As this ability grew, he was able to devote less and less of his mental energy to the physical actions of thrust, parry, and counter-thrust. This allowed him to keep his mind focused so he could use the Force to anticipate his opponent's moves, while at the same time obscuring and confusing his enemy's own precognitive senses. The last time he and Foharg had fought, Bane had still been a novice. He had only learned a handful of sequences. Now he knew almost 100, and he was able to transition smoothly from the end of one sequence into the beginning of another, opening up a wider range of attack and defense combinations. And more options made it more difficult for a foe to use the Force to anticipate his opponents. Foharg, despite his terrifying appearance, was smaller and lighter than his opponent. Physically outmatched by the brute force of Bane's Form 5, he was forced to rely on the defensive style of Form 3 to keep his larger opponent's overpowering attacks at bay. Spinning his training saber in a quick flourish, Bane leapt high in the air and came crashing down from above. Vohark parried the attack but was knocked to the ground. He rolled onto his back and barely managed to get his saber up in time to block Bane's next slashing attack. A chorus of metal on metal rang out as Bane's blows descended in like rain. The Markuf kept him from landing a direct hit with a masterful defensive flurry, then swept Bane off his feet with a leg whip, leaving them both surprised. Oh, supine. They flipped their feet simultaneously, mirror images, and their sabers met with another resounding crash before they disengaged once again. There were some whispers and mutters from the assembled crowd, but Bane did his best to tune them out. They had thought the battle was over, as had Bane himself. He was disappointed that he hadn't been able to finish off his fallen opponent, but he knew victory was near. Vohark's survival had extracted a heavy toll. He was breathing in ragged gasps now, his shoulders slumping. Bane rushed Vohark again. This time, however, the Markuf didn't back away. He stepped forward with a quick thrust, switching from Form 3 to the more precise and aggressive Form 2. Bane was caught off guard by the unexpected maneuver and was a microsecond slow in recognizing the change. His parry attempt knocked the tip of the blade away from his chest, only to have it slice across his right shoulder. The crowd gasped. Vohark howled in victory, and Bane screamed in pain as the saber slipped to the ground from his suddenly nerveless fingers. Mindlessly, Bane used his other hand to shove his opponent in the chest. Vohark reeled backwards and Bane rolled to safety. Scrambling to his feet, Bane extended his left hand to the training saber lying on the ground 3 meters away. It sprang up and into his palm, and he once again assumed the ready position, his right arm dangling uselessly at his side. Some Sith learned to fight with either hand, but Bane hadn't yet reached that advanced stage. The weapon felt awkward and clumsy as he held it. Left-handed, he was no match for Vohark. The fight was over. His opponent sensed it as well. "Defeat is bitter, human," he growled in basic, his voice deep and menacing. "I have bested you. You have lost." He wasn't asking Bane to yield. Surrender was never an option. He was simply taunting him, publicly humiliating him in front of the other students. "You trained for weeks to challenge me," Vohark continued, drawing out his mockery. "You failed. Victory is mine again." "Then come finish me," Bane snapped back. There wasn't much else he could say. Everything his enemy said in his heavily accented basic was true, and the words cut far deeper than the blunted training saber's edge possibly could. "No. This ends when I choose," the Markuf replied, refusing to be baited. The eyes of the other apprentices burned into Bane. He could feel them drinking in his suffering as they stared at him. They resented him, resented the extra attention he had been receiving from the masters. Now, they reveled in his failure. "You are weak," Vohark explained, casually twirling his own saber in a complex and intricate pattern. "You are predictable." "Stop it!" Bane wanted to scream. "End this! Finish me!" But despite the emotion building up inside him, he refused to give his opponent the satisfaction of saying another word. Instead, he let the all but useless saber fall once more to the ground. In the background, he could see the Blade Master watching it intently, curious to see how the confrontation would reach its inevitable end. The masters coset you. They give you extra time and attention. More than the others. More than me. Bane barely even heard the words anymore. His heart was pounding so loud he could hear the blood coursing through his veins. Literally quaking with impotent rage, he lowered his head and dropped to one knee, exposing his bare neck. Despite all of their efforts, you are still my inferior, Bane of the Sith. Bane. Something in the way Fohark said it caused Bane to glance up. It was the same way his father used to say the word. That the name is mine. Bane whispered, his voice low and threatening. Nobody uses it against me. Fohark either didn't hear him or didn't care. He took a leisurely step forward. Bane. Worthless and insignificant nothing. The masters wasted their time on you. Time better spent on other students. You are well named, for you truly are this academy's bane. No! Bane screamed, thrusting his good hand out, palm forward, even as Fohark leapt in to finish him off. The dark side energy erupted from his open palm to catch his opponent mid-air, hurling him back to the edge of the crowd, where he landed at Kasim's feet. The master watched with an intrigued but wary expression. Bane slowly clenched his fist and rose to his feet. On the ground before him, Fohark was writhing in agony, clutching at his throat and gasping for breath. Unlike the Markuf, Bane had nothing to say to his helpless opponent. He squeezed his fist harder, feeling the force rushing through him like a divine wind as he crushed the life out of his foe. Fohark's heels pounded out a staccato rhythm on the temple's stone roof as his body convulsed. He began to gurgle, and pink froth welled up from between his lips. Enough, Bane! Kasim said in a cold, even voice. Though he stood only centimeters away from the death throes of his student, his eyes were fixed on the one still standing. The final surge of power roared up in the core of Bane's being and exploded out into the world. In response, Fohark's body went stiff and his eyes rolled back in his head. Bane released his hold on the Force and his fallen enemy, and the Markuf's body went limp as the last vestiges of his life ebbed away. Now it's enough, Bane said, turning his back on the corpse and walking towards the stairs that led back inside the temple. A circle of students quickly opened up a path for him to pass. He didn't need to look back to know that Kasim was now watching him with greater interest. Bane felt the presence of someone following him down the stairs from the temple roof long before he heard the footsteps. He didn't change his pace, but he did stop at the first landing and turn to face whoever it was. He half expected to see Lord Kasim, but instead of the Blade Master, he found himself staring into the orange eyes of Sirak, another apprentice at the academy, or rather, the top apprentice at the academy. Sirak was a Zabrak, one of the 3 apprentices here on Korriban. Zabrak tended to be ambitious, driven, and arrogant. Perhaps it was these traits that made them force sensitive of the race, so strong in the ways of the dark side. And Sirak was the perfect embodiment of all these characteristics. He was far and away the strongest of the 3. Wherever Sirak went, the other 2 usually followed, trailing at his heel like obedient slaves. They made a colorful trio: red-skinned Loke and Yivra, and the pale yellow Sirak. But right now the other 2 were conspicuously absent. There were rumors that Sirak had begun studying the ways of the dark side under Lord Cordis nearly 20 years ago, long before the academy at Korriban had been resurrected. Bane didn't know if the rumors were true, and he hadn't thought it was wise to ask about it. The Iridonian Zabrak was both powerful and dangerous. So far, Bane had done his best to avoid drawing the attention of the Academy's most advanced student. Apparently, that strategy was no longer an option. The rush of adrenaline he'd felt as he'd ended Forok's life was fading, along with the confidence and sense of invincibility that had led to his dramatic exit. Bane wasn't exactly afraid of the Zabrak approaching him, but he was wary. Give me a moment. Hydration check. And I'm back. Now, where were we? In the dim torchlight of the temple, Sirak's pale yellow skin had taken on a sickly, waxen hue. Unbidden, it brought back memories of Bane's first year working the mines on Apatros. A crew of 5, 3 men and 2 women, had been trapped in a cave-in. They had survived the collapsing tunnel by escaping into a reinforced safety chamber dug out of rock. But noxious fumes released in the collapse had seeped into their haven and killed them all before rescue teams could dig them out. The complexion of their bloated corpses was the exact same color as Sirak's, the color of a slow, agonizing death. Bane shook his head, pushing the memory away. That life belonged to Des, and Des was gone. "What do you want?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "You know why I'm here," was the icy response. "Fohark. Was he a friend of yours?" Bane was genuinely confused. With the exception of his fellow Zabrak, Sirak rarely mingled with the other students. In fact, many of the accusations Fohark had leveled at Bane, such as preferential treatment from the Masters, could easily be applied to Sirak as well. "The Markuf was neither friend nor enemy," was the haughty reply. "He was beneath my notice. As were you. Until now." Bane's only reply was a steady, unblinking stare. The flickering torches, reflecting off the Zabrak's pupil, made it seem as if hungry flames licked away at the inside of his skull. "You are an intriguing opponent," Sirak whispered, taking a step closer. "Formidable. At least compared with the other so-called apprentices here. I am watching you now. I am waiting." He reached out slowly and pressed his finger into Bane's chest. Bane had to fight the urge to take a step back. "I do not issue challenges," the Zabrak continued. "I have no need to test myself against a lesser opponent." Flashing a cruel smile, he lowered his finger and took a step back. "However, when you fool yourself into believing that you are ready, you will inevitably challenge me. I shall be looking forward to it." With that, he brushed past Bane on the narrow landing, bumping him slightly with his shoulder as if unaware of him. then continuing on down the stairs to the level below. The message of that slight bump was not lost on Bane. He knew Serac was trying to intimidate him, to goad him into a confrontation Bane wasn't ready for. He wasn't about to fall for the trap. Instead, he stood motionless at the top of the landing, refusing to turn and watch Serac depart. Only when he heard the sounds of the rest of the class descending from the roof did he move again, spinning on his heel and continuing down the stairs to the lower levels and the privacy of his own room. And that's it, everybody. That's all for today for Literature Night. Bane's story is an interesting one. From an uncertain minor young man, he has grown to become an overconfident and arrogant Sith apprentice, not understanding that it was only by sheer luck that he managed to defeat his opponent, the Markuth. If he's not careful, something else will happen to him in time. Another crushing defeat, perhaps. Or maybe worse. But I'll save that for the next episode. Thank you all for stopping by the bar. Please leave your glasses on the bar counter once you're done with your drinks. Don't forget your belongings as you leave. And I hope and I wish all of you a safe trip home. Everyone, thank you for stopping by, and I will see you all in the next episode. Jane, bye bye.